Jesus was rejected by God. It's an important point that we have to remember. Why is the bigger question. My name is Dr. Brian Jenkins. This is Theology Threads. We're going to be talking about that today, as well as how all of the message of atonement is hidden in a story in the Bible that you may not even realize. So stick around and find out. Well, hello everybody. Welcome back. Dr. Brian Jenkins here to Theology Threads as we get started and continue in our series on the atonement. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of reconciliation, or the idea that we are restored to the family of God. Before we get into that, take a moment to share this episode, give us a comment, let us know where you're joining us from if you're on YouTube, and if you're on the podcast, make sure you give us a like over there as well. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, first off, we've got to take a look at what was the whole point. How are we originally intended to live? That's step number one. Step number two, we have to remember that we broke it, right? God made it one way. That's step one. Step two is we broke it. So what does that mean? Where does sin leave us in our relationship with God as his family? Step number three, what did Jesus actually do? What was, as we'll introduce, the great exchange moment on the cross? Step number four, we'll take a look at the great theologian of the early church, Paul, and how he talks about it. And then finally, step number five, what it means for us, how we can fold it in and incorporate it into our lives and press it into every corner of how we live it out. So let's dive in and let's take a look at the concept of reconciliation and the idea that we are more than forgiven. The word for today and the metaphor of atonement that we're going to be talking about is the word reconciliation. The idea that atonement is sort of revealed to us in a family way, that atonement is revealed to us in a family way. When we're talking about these different theories of atonement and these different metaphors, we have to remember that metaphors are beautiful and they're wonderful and they're incredible, and they allow us to bring the complexity of something like the atonement into the kind of full relief, to really understand what it is. But one of the things that we also have to understand about metaphor is that although it is helpful, Sally McFague puts it this way in her writing. She says, most simply, a metaphor is seeing one thing as something else, pretending that this is that, because we don't know how to talk or think about this. So we use that as a way of saying something about it. So metaphors are best understood in an as-if structure. So when I'm talking today about the atonement, we're talking about the idea that the atonement is an event that happened as if it happened in a family, or as if it happened as reconciliation. But one thing McFague also points out that I think is critical to remember is, although it points out that it is this way, always in metaphor, we need to remember just a little bit of slices, but it also isn't. Why would I say that? All metaphors have limitation. And when we're talking about all of the metaphors that deal with the atonement, all of them have beautiful ways of bringing this complexity into kind of full view, but we also are going to wind up struggling with some of them because they are limited as well. So what are we talking about today? Charles Oden, in his commentary, one of the things that he emphasizes the most is that the atonement is more than a concept, it is an event. It is something that happened, that we are. It is something that is done to us. So it's not just an idea or a theological abstract, it is an actual thing that occurs. But it is so complex and it's so mysterious in so many ways that even in the Bible, we have to use words from other areas, we have to use words from other realities to try to help us even begin to understand it. There are just some things that are too big, if you will, to be dealt with literally. And so the Bible uses powerful metaphors. And one of the metaphors about atonement, the one we're going to focus on in this session, is the idea of restoration. Reconciliation is the word we're going to use, of family. And with the big idea, the one thing I really want you to grasp today is that through the atonement, Jesus returns us to God's family. Through the atonement, Jesus secures and returns our spot, our place, back into God's family. So let's go all the way back. Point one, how are we meant to live? Well, if we remember, We were created by God. God made it, and we were created on purpose for a purpose. And the reason we were created is to be in a loving, worshipful relationship with God. So our very created nature, our very created reality is a place where we know God and are known by God. So we are meant to be connected to God in a way that a family is. He is our Father, and we are His children. But then, as we say in our construct, we broke it. Sin is the thing that disrupts that familial relationship. Okay? So what that leaves us with is, in that moment, how does sin do that? In that moment, we choose our own place in the universe. We choose our own place in creation. So God has given us a place in creation. It's a place of worshipful, loving relationship with Him. We then, in sin, both in Adam's and Eve's original sin, and even in our own lives, every day, we will choose a point at some point where we say, no, I want to secure my own place in reality. I want to secure my own place in the universe. That's what we do when we sin. That's what Adam and Eve did in Genesis chapter 3. When they sinned, they said, we don't want the place God has for us. We want our own place. And in doing that, we literally displace ourselves from our created order in the universe, which leads to all of the fracture, all of the disruption. Why? Because now nothing is in its right place. Have you ever walked into a room that's been messed up, or the kids have come through and nothing is where you think it should be? Nothing is where it's supposed to be. Nothing is in order. Nothing is in its appointed place, doing what it's there to do. That is the very definition of chaos. And we know from creation that God brings order out of chaos. The whole order of the universe is that it's meant to be ordered. And our sin, our defiance, our rebellion brings chaos and displacement in. And so what we see then in Genesis 3 is the work of how can we do this. Now, in Genesis 3, what happens is God then has to expel them from the garden. So now He is saying, this is the reality you've chosen, so I'm going to grant it. And that is isolation, displacement. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to be talking about all of the effects of sin and how the atonement undoes, that's not a word, but that's okay, how the atonement undoes that effect of sin. And so commentators and theologians will say, look at everything sin does to us. But in the atonement, it undoes all those things. And so one of the things sin does to us is it isolates us. It displaces us from our relationship with God. So God walks into the garden. In fact, if you think about it in Genesis 3, pay attention to the first question God asks. Adam, where are you? Why aren't you where you're supposed to be? Why aren't you at your place? Why have you, what has displaced you? And so the idea then is that rather than being in loving relationship with God, we are now in rebellion and defiance with God. And instead of Him being a father, He is now an enemy. And one of the things that we have to remember in all of this scenario is that this is what we've done against Him. God is not our enemy in the sense that God has turned Himself against us. We, in sin and in defiance, turn ourselves against God. And the word there, the Bible word for that is enmity. There is this fractured, broken relationship. So what does God do? Well, God could judge us. God could end us. God could wipe the slate clean and start all over again. God could say, this little experiment was a joke and just end it all. But because God chose to create us and God chose to be in relationship with us, He leans into His own choice and says, I'm going to keep this promise alive. And that comes through the promise of reconciliation. So when I talk about reconciliation, what am I really talking about? I want to talk about it mostly from a New Testament perspective in our time together. I want to look at it from the way of what did the word mean when it's used particularly by Paul and other authors, but by Paul. So one of the the passage that we used last week, and we'll use it again this week in this session, is Romans chapter 5, verse 6. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Though one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, one would even care to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, and then here's the ultimate definition of atonement, Christ died for us. It's what I'm going to be calling for the rest of our sessions together in this particular series, the Great Exchange. There is an exchange that is the heart of all atonement, that Jesus on the cross becomes and acts as one of us. At one ment is really what atonement means. And at one moment, at oneness with us, he stands in and swaps out. So everything that we deserve, everything that we've chosen, everything that we've earned that has to be paid in order for the order and the justice of the universe to exist, right? That is then taken upon Jesus rather than us. And that's the essence of all of the theories of atonement and all the metaphors that we'll use. That's at the heart of it. That the thing that we earned in this particular discussion, isolation and displacement from our place in the universe. We earned that. We chose that. That's what we're saying that we wanted. Okay? Christ then says, I will take that so that you can be restored, you can be reconciled, you can get back to how you were created to be. Listen to what he says, verse 9. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. So we've been justified. In other words, we've been forgiven. We've been saved from God's wrath. For if, verse 10, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. So what Paul is saying is that, think about it. If we were reconciled while we were enemies, how much more now that we are reconciled will be saved? More than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. So why the big deal about reconciliation? Why focus on that word? And again, you can use reconciliation, you can use restoration, you can use all sorts of words that go in there. The word in Greek that Paul is using here is katalasso. And it has all these different meanings, it has all these different forms, but that's the essence of it. And in classical Greek, it generally understood to be this. And this is, I think this is so cool. It is the restoration of the original understanding between people after hostility has ended. The original understanding of people. That's why the concept of the atonement, that's why the concept of the atonement as reconciliation is so critical. We are, and I want you to get these three words, we are more than forgiven. When we talk about the reconciliation, what we're really, and the reconciliation through the atonement, what we're talking about is not just forgiveness. It's very easy to say, well, Jesus died to forgive us of our sins. Yes, but he died for infinitely more than that. We are not just, or we are not simply forgiven. We are more than forgiven. We are reconciled. We are restored, returned to the way things were before we became enemies with God through sin. I want you to think about that. Think about all of our modern concepts of forgiveness. Just for a second. How often do we say, I forgive you, but things are never going to be the same again? I heard what you said about me at work. You were having a bad day. I forgive you, but man, I'm never going to trust you again. I'm never going to confide in you again. I'm never going to lean into you for advice again. In fact, we actually would see that in some ways as a form of relational foolishness. And there's probably some wisdom to that. But when the Bible says that Jesus came to reconcile us to God, it's not just to forgive us. It's not just to make everything okay. It's not just to, you know what, forget it and move on. It is God, through Christ, makes things as though it had never happened. Everything is returned, it is restored, it is reconciled back to that garden reality of unfettered, unhindered relationship with God. That's the point of reconciliation. And so we wonder, well, what does that mean for me? What is that? Look, how is that even possible? Let's go to Colossians, for example. In Colossians chapter 1. In Colossians chapter 1, Paul writes this. Colossians chapter 1, verse 19. Paul writes, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things." So through Christ, everything is going to be brought back to essentially to the way things were, the restoration of the original understanding. If you want to use our broader Theology Threads language, it is the complete restoration of shalom, of the intended fabric of reality, that things will return to the way they are supposed to be. And he does this whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So that idea of now that we've made peace with God, we are truly reconciled, we are restored. And you, now listen to Paul's language, and you who were once, and listen to the word that Paul uses here, who were alienated and hostile in mind. That's what we chose as humanity in the garden, and that's what we choose every time we choose to go our own way in sin. Every time we choose to say, God, I know what you say about money, but I'm going to do my own thing. God, I know what you say about how I treat my body, but I'm going to do my own thing. God, I know what you say about how to treat other people, but I'm going to do my own thing. Every time we do that, we are choosing alienation and hostile relationship with God. And he says, and because you were once that, he has now, speaking of Jesus, verse 22, reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. So what is that? That's the cross. So in the cross, he takes upon our hostility, he takes upon our alienation onto himself and swaps it out. He becomes at one with us. That's the nature of the atonement. Why? So that we're not just simply forgiven, but we are restored. In Matthew 27:46, Jesus is on the cross. And it's in that moment that he quotes the Psalms. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And you know, I think many of us, when we read that, that's a pretty troubling passage. We wonder, what does that mean? And that's the moment. That's the moment where Jesus is embodying and taking on in his atonement role, in the event of the atonement, he is taking on everything that we feel about God. That we have been forsaken, that we have been rejected, that we have been turned aside, that the guilt and the shame from our sin that we carry on our shoulders all day long, Jesus takes that on himself. And because he takes on that alienation, because he takes on that hostility, the Bible says that the wrath of God poured out on Jesus in that moment. Because he takes that on, we don't. So how does this work in the grand justice of the universe? It's justice because the order is kept. It's justice because the reality is maintained, that sin has consequences, that the wages of sin, as Paul writes in Romans 3, is death, that sin has an outcome. That's the way that defiance of any kind, that defiance, that rebellion, that sin, all of it has an outcome. And that outcome has to come to pass. If it doesn't come to pass, then there is no true order in the universe. It would be like saying 2 minus 1 is 1, but it's not really, because I'm just going to always throw another one on there. There's an order to the way things work. What goes up must come down, right? The speed of light is fixed, and nothing can ever go faster than the speed of light. You know, Matter is neither created nor destroyed. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's simply redistributed. There's an order to how all this works. And there is a moral order to how this all works. And any time that moral balance of the universe is disruptive, something needs to fill it in order for there to be holiness, in order for there to be justice. And we all want justice. We all do, and we understand that. So Jesus says, out of my sovereignty and my power and my strength, I will provide justice. But out of his love, he says, I will receive the justice. I will make sure that the debt is paid. And why can that happen? Because in sin, Jesus, in sin, God is the offended party. So the one who has borne the offense is the one who pays for the offense. So it fulfills justice because the offense is paid for. It is reconciled on the books, if you will. But it's love because it's more than forgiveness. Jesus doesn't teach us this in terms of like an A plus B equals C propositional truth like Paul does. Paul walks us through Romans 5, Colossians, as I read, Colossians 1, there's a section in Ephesians 2, there's a section in 2 Corinthians 5, and they all deal with this idea of reconciliation, of restoration. But I think it's probably more powerful, rather than to try to teach it theologically as a proposition, to just teach it to you narratively the way Jesus did. Jesus tells a story, not just about forgiveness, but really about reconciliation. It's the story from Luke chapter 15. We call it the parable of the prodigal son. It's really the third in a cycle of lost things. So actually it's the parable of the lost son. But he says this, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. So what did the son do? The son said, I want to be on my own. I'm going to reject your lordship. I'm going to reject your fatherhood over me. And I am going to leave you to go do what I want. So in living under his own concept of independence, the son defies the father. I think you're getting the metaphors pretty, it's kind of on the nose, right? The son defies the father and goes his own way. And the father allows it to happen, okay? Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. That's where the concept prodigal comes from, because prodigal doesn't mean lost. It actually means flamboyant or extravagant, like prodigious or prodigy, something that's above and beyond. So he's the prodigal son because of his spending. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs, and he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. Jesus is telling us in a story how sin works. We choose what we want. We're going to go our own way because we think we can do it better. And at some point, it's going to run out. And when it runs out, we will start looking to anything and everything to meet our needs. And it's still insufficient. We can never quite get it back to the way things were. The son knows I'll never be as happy and as safe and as content and as cared for. I'll never be that again, no matter how hard I work. And the truth is that the people and the ones that he's going to are degrading him. They're humiliating him in order to make him get what he needs from them. They humiliate him by making him feed pigs. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I have to perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So the son realizes his mistake. He repents, essentially. He turns from his ways and he goes back, and he knows, though, that his worthiness, his place in the family is completely annihilated. Surely it could never be restored. Why? There's an economic reality to this. Part of his place in the family as the second son was the financial gift that he had. He would have been entitled to a certain amount of everything the family owned, and by asking the father for it prematurely, he took all of that. So he didn't just take his money, he took what the family had. He took his portion that was quote unquote owed him, and then he blew it. That money is gone. And it's not just gone from him, the whole family lost out on his choices. So he says, I'm not worthy to be called your son. And he arose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, suffered with him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Boy, that would have changed the story. And kissed him. And while he arose and came to his father, while he was still a long way off, Romans chapter 5, verse 8, God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, while we were still a long way off, Christ died for us. To what end? Well, according to Paul in Romans 5, not just for forgiveness, but reconciliation. His father saw him, felt compassion, ran, embraced him, and kissed him. And listen to this. The son says to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. The son gets it. By every rule of culture, every rule of honor, every rule of the natural way of doing things, every rule, hear me on this, every rule of justice says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I'm simply asking for forgiveness. And that's a lot of times how we bring our sin back to God. God, I'm not worthy. I'm horrible. I'm the worst. If you could just make these bad feelings about myself go away, that's enough. Verse 22, but the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. That is reconciliation. It's not just that you're forgiven, it's that you are a part of the family once again. It's not just that I'm forgiven, it's that I am God's son once again. And I go from being a place of alienation and hostility, as Paul writes in Colossians, to a place of embracing and to a place of restoration. And even the older brother, he gets mad because he wants justice. He said, this isn't fair. What you're doing isn't fair. I understand letting him back, but you actually want to spend our money. You want to now, because he's a son, now he's entitled to whatever the family has now. So he's already blown a bunch of their money, but now he's entitled back into a portion of what's left. So everyone's inheritance has decreased because of the actions of this level of reconciliation. We would never, as humans. I was talking to one of the guys I work with yesterday, and I couldn't wrap my brain around it. I don't know that anything inside of me would want to achieve this level of reconciliation. I think we'd love to forgive. I think we're okay with that, but really making things as though they'd never been before, that would be a stretch for all of us. And the older son was mad. He said, look, this isn't fair. And he wants justice. He said, I never disobeyed you, verse 29. You never even gave me a goat. You're killing a calf for him. All I wanted was a goat just so I could have a celebration. And the father looked at him. Now, it's interesting, too. I don't want to go too fast. He says, talk about family, by the way, and restoration, how we view things. Look at what the brother says in verse 30. When this son of yours, the brother hasn't reconciled with the other son. He's still saying, he's not even my brother. He's just your son. So you see the contrast in what's going on here. And then he said to him in verse 31, this is the father saying to the older brother, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and he is found. That's reconciliation. Your brother has come back to us. He is family again. So when we talk about the gospel in all the multiple ways that it does, one of the things that it does is we are family again. We become part of God's family again. So if we chew on that question, why did Jesus have to die? Why did Jesus choose to die? Jesus died to serve justice because justice must be served before any reconciliation can be offered. You can't offer reconciliation without justice. That's just letting someone get away with it. That's actually not dealing with an issue. Justice is dealing with the reality of a choice, and reconciliation is the restoration to the original settings, if you will, to the original understanding between two parties. And sin, if it's the unseating, if it's the removal, if it's the alienation and the engagement in hostilities with God, then the atonement is not just forgiving that rebellion, but it's also saying, okay, and now you're back. We're good. Everything is restored. So what does it mean for us? How can I live out, if you will, the reconciliation? One of the things you have to do is you just have to kind of wrap your head around it. You have to stay in passages like Romans chapter 5, like 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Read through, study, meditate on Ephesians chapter 2 or Colossians chapter 1. Bring the story of the prodigal son and reflect on it, meditate on it, marinate on it, let it seep in your heart. Wrap your brain around the fact that not only does God want to forgive you, He wants things to go back to the way they were. Even though He's the offended party in our sin, He is offering you the chance through Christ to make all things new, to go back to square one, to go back to the way it should have always been, so that it can become everything it was meant to be. You have to wrap your head around it. The other thing you have to do is you have to wrap your heart around it. You have to experience this. You say, well, how am I can't give you instructions on how to experience it. You have to pray and ask God to press it into every corner of your life. When you're at your church, if you're a part of a local church and you sing and worship, find this theme in the songs of your church. Find worship songs that echo this theme of being family again. That's what you are. You are family. God has accepted you back as a son, as a daughter, with all of your rights to blessing, your rights to happiness, your rights to contentment, your rights to peace, your rights to joy. All of the things that are entitled to you as a child of God are fully restored. Why? Because Christ was rejected. Christ was rejected so that we don't have to be. So don't just wrap your head around the concept. Get your heart wrapped around it. Let it sink deeply into your emotions. And then you have to really wrap all of your actions around it. How can I now live in what Paul calls in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the ministry of reconciliation? How can I even begin to offer this amount of reconciliation to people? By the way, I wrote in my notes, that's why we have to practice forgiveness and we have to practice restoration. We have to practice reconciliation. The reason we have to practice it is because we'll never master it. We just have to seek it. We have to keep going. And then with God's help, do our best. With God's grace, keep moving forward. And say, are there people who have come to God seeking to be reconciled? But now our small group needs to be a place of reconciliation. Pastor, is your church a place of reconciliation, of restoration? Parents, is your home a place of restoration and reconciliation? You say, well, Brian, what about wisdom? What about experience? What about... That's why you have to wrap your head and your heart around it before you can ever start doing it. But we are called to live it out. We are Christ's ambassadors, bringing His message of reconciliation, pleading with people, be reconciled to God. God does not want you to feel like your enemies. You are not God's enemy. You're God's child. We may think God is our enemy, but God does not see us as enemies. And He wants to be reconciled. He wants things to go back, so much so that through Jesus, He's willing to reset everything and bring you back to Him. It's been a challenge for me as I've been prepping for this. I hope it's a challenge for you. I hope that you take a second and subscribe to the channel Leave any comments or reflections below. Make sure you take a moment and share this episode. And if you're on a podcast, make sure you're leaving us that 5-star review so others can find us. Hey, God bless you. Have a great day.